Okay. Hey, that works. All right. Well, our guest speaker tonight, in great big bold print on up front, is Jeff Kozma. He's a wildlife biologist with the Yakama Nation, so central Washington, and he's going to talk to us about white-headed woodpeckers. But I think Jeff, your 20 years is probably 22 now.
Yes, that's correct. Yep. Yep.
Yes. And if you go online, Jeff has done many studies on the white-headed woodpeckers, and let's just call him the expert. And so it's great to have you here. Um, a trivia question: does anybody know when Jeff last spoke to the Spokane Audubon? Any guesses? Okay, no takers. So Jeff was our guest speaker in November of 2012. So I'm sure he's picked up a few things since then. So it's great to have you back, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And with that, we'll turn it over to you.
All right,
Thank you.
wonderful. Well, thank you, Spokane Audubon, all your members, for having me speak to you tonight. I really enjoy doing these presentations. I got, well, as you can imagine, over 20 plus years of research. I have a lot of information to present, so I'll just kind of get into that. I do want to acknowledge my two co-authors on this study. The first is AJ Kroll. He's a scientist with Weyerhaeuser. And without him, it probably would have been a lot harder for me to do a lot of the statistical analysis that I've done with my data. So he's been my collaborator on a lot of my publications doing the data analysis. And then Kevin Lucas, my volunteer extraordinaire, he's a local Yakima person here. And he has helped me do probably 90% of my banding of the woodpeckers. And I also call him my MacGyver, because whatever I need, he can create it or build it for me. So just wanted to acknowledge them. So let's see. Okay, so the white-headed woodpecker, I'm sure most of us in the room are familiar with this species. But they kind of have a disjunct population throughout the western United States, primarily in Oregon, Washington, and California, a little bit into Idaho. And they're a species that relies primarily on large seeded pine trees for a lot of their food and foraging. So they're kind of really restricted to those areas where those large seeded pines occur. And they're a year-round resident. We don't have any indication that they are migratory or even move elevationally. And in the very southern portion of the range in Southern California, there's a subspecies called Gravirostris, which actually has a significantly longer bill and a significantly longer tail than the more northern populations of white-headeds. And that's an adaptation for feeding on those larger seeded, the larger cones of the pine trees down in that area, like coulter pine and digger pine and things like that. So significantly different in size of some of their structure. So why study white-headed woodpeckers? Well, when I started my position here at the Yakama Nation, they were the least studied woodpecker in North America. And the main part of my job is reviewing timber sales within the Yakama Nation's ceded lands. And this species was also always referenced as a species that required old growth ponderosa pine for the greater part of its population. But when I started this position and started getting out in the field, I was finding these birds in heavily managed stands with really small diameter trees. And so I was just curious as to how well they were doing in these managed landscapes compared to what the literature was saying. But when I started trying to look up information in Washington on this species, there had only been one study that was done from Joe Buchanan and his colleagues at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that was published in 2003. And all that did was basically describe some characteristics of their nest sites. So I did not have a lot of information. So that kind of started my research, and 20 years later, I'm still doing it and still have questions. So. And as of now, between myself and my colleagues, we've published 17 papers dealing with some aspect of white-headed woodpecker ecology here in Washington. So it's we really learned a lot about the species and how well they're not doing in managed stands. And that's the whole portion, the whole point of this presentation is to describe how this species is doing. So as I mentioned, historically, they were thought to be tied to old growth structure, but where I was working, there was very limited old growth. And in Washington, they're considered a species of concern or a conservation management species because of their restricted habitat range. And as I mentioned, they're also dependent on primarily one tree species here in Washington, and that's the ponderosa pine. So the objectives of my study were to first focus on managed forests. I wanted to describe their nest site characteristics. In other words, what are the characteristics of the snags and the associated habitat around those snags that they're using for nesting? I wanted to look at their reproductive success, or in other words, their nest survival. I wanted to find out how well these birds were reproducing in these managed stands. I collected data on parental provisioning because there's no information about what this species feeds on in terms of insects or what they're feeding their chicks. And I also wanted to estimate adult annual survival, and that I've done using color banded birds and some bird banding. So these are my study areas. You can see they're primarily within Yakima County. I work entirely off the Yakima Reservation, so my study areas were on Forest Service land, Department of Fish and Wildlife land, Department of Natural Resources land, as well as some private landowners scattered throughout. So you can kind of see where those were located. But my biggest study area was the area in the Weenass that I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with, because that's where Audubon, Washington Audubon has their annual campout every year in May. So let's talk about the methods. So how did I determine nest survival? Well, the first thing to do, of course, is to search for nests. When I would find a cavity, when I would find a nest, I would use a treetop peeper. That was actually the name of the device. I know it sounds kind of funny, but what it was a probe that was located at the top of a telescoping pole, and that telescoping pole would reach up to a maximum of about 30 feet in height. So that allowed me to see into most cavities that I found. So you put that probe inside the cavity, and there's a monitor on the lower part of the extending pole. And on that monitor, it shows an image, a video image of what's going on inside the nest cavity. So that is how I was able to get information on number of eggs laid, the number of chicks that were fledged, things like that. So this here would be an image of what I would see on the monitor. And the first one there in the middle, those were recently hatched white-headed woodpecker chicks. And you can see there's one egg to the left there that either didn't hatch or hadn't hatched yet. And the one at the bottom was a female white-headed woodpecker that had been incubating the eggs when I stuck the nest probe in there. So she was looking up trying to figure out what in the heck is this big light shining at me while I'm in my nest cavity. So you can see that the images were really detailed, and I could see a lot what was going on. I would try to determine the fate. So in other words, was the nest successful or did it fail? And then after the nest was done, I would measure habitat characteristics around the nest site. And those included things such as cavity height, height of the snag, diameter of the snag. We measured the shrub density, the tree density, the herbaceous density around those. We measured canopy cover, a whole slew of different habitat characteristics. And then when we were done, we tagged each snag with a blue metal numbered tag so that if the bird reused those snags, we would know that information. To look at provisioning, I used a Pentax spotting scope with a 10 power eyepiece. And I would dress in full camouflage, anywhere from about 100 to 160 feet from the nest. And I began observations after the adults resumed normal activity. So a lot of times what would happen is I would walk into where the nest was, I'd be setting up my seat, my spotting scope, getting everything ready, my data sheets, and one of the adults would come back and see me. And when they have chicks in the nest, they can get disturbed fairly easily. They'll start calling, they'll be flying around. So I would have to wait until normal activity resumes. So the birds were going to and from the cavity feeding. They weren't bothered by me. And sometimes that wouldn't happen. Sometimes they would be so disturbed and distraught that no matter how long I waited, they wouldn't calm down. So I would leave and then come back another day because I couldn't get good, accurate representation of feeding intervals and things like that if the birds were disturbed by my presence. And I always tried to view the cavity from the side, such as what this picture is showing, so that I could try to see as much detail about what the birds were carrying in their bills when they were returning to the nest with food. So I monitored these cavities for 2-hour time periods between 8 a.m. and noon. So it could have started at 9 and went to 11, or 9:30 to 11:30, just some 2-hour period in that 4-hour window. And I did this twice, once for each nest cavity, once when nestlings were 1 to 13 days old, and again when the nestlings were 14 to 26 days old. So each time a bird came back to the cavity with food, I recorded the sex of the adult, the amount of time between visits using a stopwatch, and if the bird removed fecal material when it fed the nestlings in the cavity. So that's what the bottom picture there is a male white-headed with a wad of wood chips from the bottom of the cavity and some of the fecal material removing that. Because I was interested to see the partitioning in the duties of the sexes when it came to feeding and sanitizing the nest cavity. So every time they brought back food, I tried to determine if the prey was small or large. So this photo here would be an example of a female returning to a nest cavity with small prey items where her beak is completely closed around the prey item, so there's no gap in there. So those were considered small. And this would be an example of a large prey item where the bill is noticeably open and you can see the contents of the insect sticking out all over the place. And what this male was bringing back looks like it was probably a moth or something like that. And then I would try to determine the prey type to order. So for example, if they brought back beetle larvae, like the big white beetle larvae, that would be in the family Coleoptera. If it was ants or a wasp or something like that, it'd be Hymenoptera. So we would try to classify as good as we can with, from what we could tell with the spotting scope. Okay, so some of the results. So for nest site characteristics, I had nests that were located in both burned and unburned forest. And you can see there was probably twice as many nests in unburned than there were in burned. But when I looked at the main habitat data, comparing between burned and unburned habitat, the only thing that differed was canopy cover was greater in unburned, which kind of makes sense because the trees had all their needles on them. And tree density, live tree density, was greater in unburned versus burned. So those two kind of made sense, but nothing else really differed between burned and unburned nest sites, including shrub cover was pretty consistent. Snag density was a little bit higher in burned, which you would expect, but statistically, there was no difference. So this table here shows the type of nest substrates that were used, and I'll go over exactly in detail examples of what these are. But type 1 is a completely live tree, and type 4 is a completely dead tree that is very well decayed. So you can kind of see the range there. So these birds, out of the 91 nests that I had, that I collected nest data from, or habitat data from, 57 of them were in the most heavily decayed substrates. And these birds are well known for using kind of softer wood and nest substrates for excavation. So the type 4 kind of made sense. Type 3s were also used, but the type 2 and the type 1s were rarely used. And you can see that what you would expect working in a ponderosa pine dominated ecosystem, that the most nests were located in ponderosa pine snags, which again makes sense. But the interesting thing here is you'll note that there was actually one blue elderberry that was used, and that is not a typo. I've had people ask me that. It was like a champion grown blue elderberry that the birds excavated a cavity in. So yeah, when you start doing this research, you never know what you're going to find. But yep, they did use at least one blue elderberry. So here would be an example of a type 1 nest substrate. So this is a completely live ponderosa pine, and this is a kind of a blow up of the base of that. And you can see where this stand had a fire at some point that had come through. The trees were still alive, but this created a fire scar in the bottom of this otherwise live ponderosa pine, and that's where the birds excavated their nest cavity. And you can see it's really close to the ground. And that is not unheard of for these birds. They are very well adapted to nesting close to the ground. And you can see on the right side of the nest cavity there how the bark has been kind of pulled away there. Well, that was from a bear that had tried to break in to the nest cavity. And luckily the wood was hard enough that it couldn't break through into the cavity and get the contents out. So the birds were lucky in that instance. This would be an example of a type 2 nest tree. So this is a recently dead ponderosa pine. You can see it still has needles on it. Still has all its branches, so it hasn't really decayed that much. But again, the nest was located in the red box all the way down there at the bottom. So again, very, very close to the ground. This would be what we consider the type 3 nest snag. So this is a little bit more advanced decay. All the needles are gone. Some of the smaller branches, some of the bark is starting to peel off the upper part of the tree. And on this one, the nest cavity was located right at the break, or where the break had been when the tree was alive. So this one was a little bit higher up. And then these are all examples of what we consider type 4 nest snags. They're the most heavily decayed. They usually have the top broken off, and so it's basically a standing stub that the birds are using. And this is the preferred nest substrate in which these birds use. So once the tree breaks, it usually indicates that it's soft enough and excavatable by the woodpeckers to create that cavity. So information that we were able to find out by looking inside the cavities is that the incubation period, the average incubation period is about 12 days. That's based on 19 nests. We had an average clutch size of 4 eggs, and that ranged anywhere from 2 to 6. And 6, I think we only had 1 nest with 6. Most were 4 to 3. The number of young fledged per nest averaged about 3 per nest, and that was based on 56 nests, and ranged from, again, 1 to 4. And on average, there's about 1 unhatched egg per nest, and about, on average, 1 of the young usually dies prior to fledging. And so what happens with woodpeckers is when they start laying their eggs, they start incubating on the day before the last egg is laid. So there's usually 1 egg that hatches later, or maybe even sometimes won't hatch, because usually when the eggs start to hatch, the adults stop incubating consistently. So there'll sometimes be 1 egg left on the bottom of the cavity, which is what this picture showed here. These birds had already left, the chicks had gone, and there was 1 egg left. And sometimes if that last egg does hatch, that chick is 1 to 2 days smaller than its siblings in the nest cavity, and sometimes it can't compete for food. So sometimes that later hatching nestling will die from starvation. So this graph here, during the study of the nesting stuff, I also looked at northern flickers, hairy woodpeckers, and western bluebirds. So I threw up here just a comparison of the hairy woodpeckers' nest initiation compared to the white-headed woodpeckers. And you can see that they're fairly well separated. The highest peak of nest initiation for the hairy woodpecker occurs during the first week of May, whereas for the white-headed woodpecker, it's about 3 weeks later during the third to the last week of May. So the 2 species are fairly well broken up in terms of when they initiate their nest. And what I mean by nest initiation is when that first egg is laid, not when the actual cavity is being excavated. So, okay, so let's look at nest survival. So how well are these birds actually reproducing? So I had 67 nests that I thought I had enough survival data to get, but I was able to actually use about 55 of those in the complete analysis of nest survival. So that spanned from 2005 to 2010. We used a computer program called Logistic Exposure, and I will not go into the details of that and bore everybody with statistics, but if anybody would like more information on any of this data that's presented, you can always email me. I have my email at the end of the presentation, and I can send you the papers that this information is based off of. And you can further read at your pleasure and ask me other questions if you need to. So we did this analysis in a two-stage process. So first we looked at time, or temporal factors. So this is stuff like when was the nest initiated, what day of the nesting period, things like that. So stuff associated with time. And then the other models we used second were based on habitat. So things like nest height, tree diameter, canopy cover, shrub cover, things like that we threw into the models to see if there was any time or habitat variables that really stood out that determined nest survival. And we used what we called a period survival rate. So we estimated that it takes about 4 days for the laying period, since there's one egg laid per day, and there's an average clutch size of 4. Incubation takes on average 12 days, and the birds fledge from the nest cavity in about 26 days after they hatch. So in total, these birds are inside that cavity from the time the egg is laid till the last chick leaves for about 40 days. So it's a long investment in the adults to raise these chicks. So what we found that there was no time effect. So in other words, the daily survival rate, or the probability of a nest surviving on any given day, was the same no matter if it was the second day in the nesting period, or the 5th day, or the 15th day, or the 30th day. We found a constant rate of survival based on time. And what we did find, though, is that the most supported habitat model was actually shrub cover. So out of all the habitat variables that we measured, nest height, cavity or tree diameter, snag height, canopy cover, tree density, snag, all those things, the only thing that came out to influence nest survival was shrub cover. And so what this graph is showing is that the daily survival rate is on the left, or on the x-axis, and on the y-axis to the right, you have percent shrub cover. And so you can see that as the daily survival rate, as percent shrub cover goes up, so in other words, you get a higher percentage of shrub cover, the daily survival rate declines. So that we thought was very interesting. And so if we calculated a period survival rate at 0% shrub cover, a white-headed woodpecker nest has about a 79% chance of fledging at least one chick when there's no shrubs. When there's a 25% shrub cover, that period survival rate declines to 66%. And at 50% shrub cover, that declines to less than 0.5%, less than 50%. So as you can see, shrub cover definitely influences the probability of a white-headed woodpecker nest fledging chicks. So what's going on here? What we think is happening is that because the majority of white-headed woodpeckers nest fairly close to the ground, that if there's a lot of shrubs covering the ground, the birds have a harder time detecting potential predators as they approach the nest cavity. So things like Douglas squirrels, yellow pine chipmunks, gopher snakes, long-tailed weasels, all these things that would be accessing the nest from the terrestrial ground, they have a harder time detecting them early enough to be able to drive them away. So basically the predators can get to the cavity easier under all that cover of shrub cover than if there was no shrub cover. And if you think about their habitat, this is a fire dominated habitat, normally would have burned every 5 to 25 years. And so routinely that shrub cover would be removed or at least knocked down. So as an adaptation for nesting close to the ground in a fire maintained landscape, the birds probably didn't have to worry about shrub cover that much. But in our the way forests are today, there's a lot more shrub cover than there was naturally. So I'm a very big proponent for prescribed burning within habitat for white-headed woodpeckers, because it helps reduce that shrub cover and could help increase nest survival and productivity. And overall egg success was about 50%. So in other words, out of all their eggs that laid, only about 50% result in a chick actually fledging the nest cavity. Okay, so let's switch to what the adults are feeding the kids. Well, I made a total of 695 feeding observations over 2 years. and 349 of those were by females and 346 were by males. So you can see there's a pretty equal distribution of feeding effort between males and females. And the majority of what females and males bring back are what we considered small items compared to large items. So these birds are central place foragers. They go to an area, they forage around, they pack as many insects as they can into their beak, and then they fly back to the cavity with a big wad of, basically a big wad of insects to feed their chicks. So they maximize their foraging effort by bringing back as much in their bills as they possibly can, as opposed to bringing back like one caterpillar at a time or one beetle at a time. So they pack as many small items in there as they can and as many large items in there as they can. And the feeding rate, as you can see here, was almost identical for males and females, about 1.6 feedings per nestling per hour. And that didn't matter if the chicks were 1 to 13 days old or 14 to 23 days old. So if they're little or if they're big, the feeding rate pretty much stayed the same. So the birds are pretty much capped at what they can, the adults are pretty much capped at the number of feedings that they can make per hour per nestling. But one thing we did find is the males are much better at cleaning the cavity than the females are. So the males made 61 fecal removals compared to only 28 by females. And so that was highly significant. So I always like to tell people that woodpeckers make really good dads because they do probably 70% of the cavity excavating. They incubate the eggs alternating with the female during the day, and the male is the one that sits on the cavity, in the cavity on the eggs at night only. And the male takes turns with the female brooding the chicks during the day, but he's the one that stays in the cavity with the chicks at night. The female never does. The male does most of the cleaning of the nest cavity, and he brings more larger items than what the females do. So woodpeckers, really, as I like to say, they make really good dads. And so take that for what it's worth, I guess. So of those 695 feeding observations, I was able to identify prey on about half of those, or about 54%. And so this is kind of the main categories of the insects that the adults were bringing back to the chicks. And you could see that the wood borer larvae, the caterpillars, and ants and their larvae were the top three food items. The all other category at the bottom consisted of an adult antlion, a bumblebee, cranefly, earwig, grasshopper, just odd stuff that they were able to capture and bring back. So with this data, I calculated what they call a niche breadth, and that number there says 0.28. So if that number had been like a 1, we would see an equal distribution of prey items amongst all the categories. But what we're seeing here is that the number is closer to 0. So the number of prey items are heavily concentrated towards just those 3 insect groups at the top of the chart there. So that was pretty interesting. So they have a really low niche breadth, focusing on 3 major insect items. So those wood borer beetle larvae, which was at the top of the list, are from a group of beetles called Cerambycidae and Buprestidae, or the round-headed borers or flat-headed borers. And what these beetles do is they find recently dead trees, the females lay their eggs, the larvae burrow into the dead wood, and they'll feed on the dead wood for anywhere from 1 to 3 years as they mature. And the top photo there is a male white-headed woodpecker returning to a cavity with one of those wood-boring beetle larvae. And you can see how large that thing is. It's basically as long or longer than the length of the beak of the woodpecker. So those are a really high protein food source for the nestling woodpeckers that are in the cavity. And the interesting thing that one of my colleagues found out is that during foraging, they pretty much stop feeding on those wood-boring larvae after the chicks fledge the cavity. So it is a very narrowly used food source, but it's an important one because they use it for the nestlings. And how they're getting those, where they're getting those from, primarily in these managed forests, are actually from cut stumps. So that bottom photo there as a male that's working on a hole where one of those beetle larvae are. And you can see all that kind of looks sawdust material there on the face of the cut stump there. That is actually frass that the beetle larvae push out of the hole as they're chewing on the dead wood. So the woodpeckers focus in on that frass, and then they dig through that hole to pull the beetle grubs out. And they do that by using their tongue, which is barbed at the tip. So the barbs kind of go backwards, the reverse barbs. So as they stick their tongue down into the hole made by the beetle larva, when they pull their tongue back, those barbs grab the edge of the beetle larva and work it towards the surface. And they do that kind of in a sewing machine motion. It's really kind of interesting to watch them extract those larvae from the wood. The second group there was predominantly caterpillars, and a lot of those were the spruce budworm larvae. So in areas where ponderosa pine occurred mixed with Douglas fir on some of the Forest Service land that I worked on, there was a pretty good population of spruce budworm, and the white-headed woodpeckers would capitalize on that food resource, because you can see in that photo there, they can really stuff a lot of caterpillars in their beak to bring it back to the nestlings in the cavity. And the third category there were ants, and they do eat a lot of those. Those include both the thatch ants, or those big mound ants that you see. They don't actually get the ants from the mounds, but when those ants go foraging in the trees for insects, that's when the woodpeckers are feeding on them. And also the carpenter ants, they really like when the winged females leave to find new areas to set up colonies in the springtime. They'll actually fly catch for the adult carpenter ants. Okay, so let's switch to estimating adult annual survival. So one of the things I was interested in is over a lot of years, when I first started this, I keep going back to the same territories. I'd always find white-headed woodpeckers there, but I had no idea if they were the same birds from year to year, how long these birds were living. So I decided to start capturing them and putting color bands on them to be able to identify individuals. So this I did only in the Weenass area, and that is my only study area that I work in now. The banding and the analysis that we used was from 2011 to 2021. So over a 10-year period. We have 19 different breeding territories where we have color banded birds. These stands were almost completely pure ponderosa pine, with the exception of maybe an occasional Douglas fir. And this area in the Weenass does have a long history of forest management. It's primarily owned by DNR and WDFW now, but it did have a long history of being managed by and owned by Boise Cascade and then later Western Pacific Timber. So this is just a graphical or a map representation of where these territories are located. So you can see how densely packed they are within a given area. The area there on the map where it says Spring Creek and it says a Lower Milk Gate Pair, that's actually the Barbecue Flats campground for those who may be familiar with the area. And this is another portion of my Weenass study area. The Weenass campground there to the kind of left side of the map is where the Audubon has their camp out every year. So you can kind of see where how well these birds are located in the green areas where it's forested. And the areas in blue are my territories that were impacted by the Cow Canyon fire a few years ago. And a couple of those the one territory, what I call EPAS front there, that was completely burned. It was a completely stand replacing fire in there, and that pair of banded whiteheads disappeared. But I still have birds within those other three burned areas from the Cow Canyon fire. So I was very happy that they stuck around. Okay, so how do we capture the feisty buggers? So to the right side of the photo, there is a snag, and in the red box is where the cavity is located, and the cavity actually faces kind of that live pine tree to the left, and you can kind of see I'm walking there towards a mist net, which I've put up in front of the nest cavity. And so what we do is we wait for the birds to come back with food when there's chicks inside the cavity, and we capture the adults bringing food back to the nestlings. And We do this when the nestlings are at least 10 days old or older, because by then they've already started to get their feathers and they can thermoregulate on their own, and they don't need the adults in the cavity to brood them and to keep them warm anymore. So if we capture the adults, we ban them, we don't have to worry about the chicks getting cold inside the cavity. When we don't capture them at the nest site, and for reasons like the nest cavity is too high, the nest fails before I can get in there to set a mist net up, or sometimes we'll put a mist net up and the adults will be too savvy, they won't go back to the cavity because they know the net's there. You know, things happen where we can't capture them at a nest cavity. So then what I do is I set up these water stations. So what that is it's a 6-gallon Rubbermaid water tub that I put large rocks in the bottom and I wedge a stick in the middle of, and I fill that up with water. And I learned that I had to put that inside of something like this hog fence cage that my friend Kevin, who's my MacGyver, built for me. So he built 4 of these for me to use. Because if you just set a thing of water out there, the coyotes, the deer, the elk, the cows, everything wants to drink that water. And so the purpose is to try to keep water in there as long as possible to attract the birds. So we put these out in the birds' territories usually starting in about early July, when it starts to get really hot and dry, when they're really craving water. And we wait a couple weeks having the water station out there, and then I'll go sit one morning and watch to see if any white-headed woodpeckers are using it yet. And sometimes it only takes a few days for the birds to find it, because like I said, during July and August, it's really hot, it's really dry in the wee nest, and the birds really like water. So this is an example of that water station with mist nets set up around it that unfortunately you can't really see, which is because mist nets are hard to see, which is why birds fly into them. But on the very far left side of the photo there, you can kind of see a pole, kind of a goldish looking pole. That's one of the ends of a mist net line. So there's 3 mist nets there in a triangle with the water in the middle, and one net runs between the water and the trees behind it, because the birds will often settle down those trees and then just kind of try to fly over to the water, and they end up hitting the mist net. And so this is where we caught probably, I'd say 70% of our woodpeckers is using these water stations. Although now I like to trap at nest cavities because it's much quicker and I don't have to set all this up and watch it and things like that. So for those who've never seen a mist netting operation, I'll just show you a short, about 2-minute video here of me extracting a male white-headed from a mist net. Oh, back. So you'll see that when we get close, when my friend Kevin zooms in closer here, you'll see this bird actually already has bands on it. We were trying to catch this male's mate, but he decided to come to the water first, and we had already banded him the year prior. So you always start with the feet, getting the feet with the netting off the feet, and then you do the tail and the wings and then the head. So you kind of work the bird backwards from how they entered the nest, how they entered the mist net. And proportionally, woodpeckers have pretty long wings, so their wings tend to get more caught up in the netting. As you can see here, I have a little bit of trouble getting it off. And with woodpeckers too, you have to be careful when you get the netting over their head, because if they have the netting in their bill, sometimes it can get caught on the barbs of their tongue. So you got to be really careful with woodpeckers. And there, now he's free from the net. And he's been through this before, so he's not very happy with me. So now what we'll do is we'll put each bird inside a holding bag. That keeps them safe from hurting themselves and getting tangled up in anything. and then we cinch it down, and then we go do a bunch of measurements. And of course, while we're doing this, we catch a lot of other birds that are attracted to the water. And for those, we just put a regular metal band on them with a metal numbered band from Fish and Wildlife Service. So if anybody recaptures them again, they'll know who banded them. But here's just some examples. We got robins, we get Townsend solitaire, Cassin's finch there on the left, chipping sparrow, hatch ear on the right, pygmy nuthatches, red-naped sapsucker, Steller's jays, western bluebirds, so a variety of different things. We get lots of crossbills when there's cones. When there's no cones, we don't get crossbills, but they're fun to catch. Their beaks are really neat to look at, how they've crossed to extract seeds, and then of course lots of white-breasted nuthatches. Okay, so once we get the woodpecker back to our banding site, which we're sitting there watching the nets the whole time, so as soon as birds hit the net, we go right over there and take them out. So the first thing I do with the bird inside the bag is I get a weight of the bird inside the bag. And then when I take the bird out, I'll weigh the bag and then subtract the two to get the weight of the bird. After we weigh the bird is when I band them. I always band them right after that, because that way if the bird wiggles free and gets loose, at least it has its bands on it before I've done any of the other measurements. And with the white-headed woodpeckers, we put 3 color bands and 1 metal numbered band on each bird. So 2 color bands on one leg and 1 metal band and a color band on another leg. And each bird gets its own unique combination of colors, so we can identify them with binoculars without having to recapture them. But if we catch a mated pair together, like at a nest cavity or at the same time on the same day at a mist net, then the pair will get the same color combination, because we can tell males from females by their plumage, by the red on the back of the head. Then after we put the bands on, we do measurements. So we get a measure of the culmen length, or the length of the upper part of the bill. Then we measure the length of the tarsus, and all this is done with digital calipers. And then we get a wing chord measurement. So the length of the wing from the bend in the wing to the longest primary feather. And then after we do all that is when we do the aging. And so woodpeckers are really unique in that you can age individuals up to about 3 to 4 years old based on the feathers that they do not molt during their regular molting process. And those occur within the primary coverts, or the feathers that cover the primary flight feathers. So the primaries there are the ones I'm holding between my fingers. Those are the long flight feathers you see on birds. And those upper black feathers in the red box are the coverts. So that's what we look at to determine the age of the birds, as I said, up to about after 3 years old. So we had 6 different age classes. So a hatchier bird is kind of self-explanatory, a bird that was born in the current, or hatched in the current year. An after hatchier bird is one that we were unable to definitely age, but we know it's older than at least 1 year, or it's at least 1 year old. A second year bird is a bird in its second calendar year of life, so it's 1 year old. And after second year is a bird that is at least after its first year of life, or its first calendar year, so it's at least 2 years old. A third year bird is a 2 year old, and an after third year bird would be at least 2 years or older. And so this would be an example of what we look at when we're aging a woodpecker's wing. And this is the same for sapsuckers, downy woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, blackbacked. All the woodpeckers kind of have the same molt strategy to within a certain degree. So the feathers that are lighter in color and that are designated by the red A on the picture there are feathers that were retained and not molted. The ones that are in the green that are jet black and fresher are ones that were currently molted in the current year. So this bird is a second year bird, and the way we can tell that the inner ones were not molted is because molt always takes place from the inside out. So when that bird was molting its feathers during its second year of life, it skipped those inner primary coverts and only molted the outer ones. So the outer ones are fresh and black, and the inner ones are worn and old. So we know that this is a second year bird. It's a bird that's in its first year of life, and it's already completed one molt. So a third year bird will have a mixture, and they can be erratic throughout, of fresh molted black feathers, maybe some that are a little bit like maybe 1 or 2 years older, and then maybe one that's really old and ratty. So looking at the molt pattern is how we are able to age our woodpeckers when we have them in the hand. And I know it sounds confusing, and it took me a long time to learn all this. But after you banded, about 150 white-headed woodpeckers, you kind of get the pattern down. So this is just an example of some of the color combinations that we used. I think we have a total of like 8 different colors that we put on the birds. So this is just some examples of what some of the color combos are. And I mentioned that they're feisty buggers. Well, this is what my hand looked like after banding one male white-headed woodpecker that was pecking at me notoriously as I was trying to get it out of a mist net. So they can exact vengeance when you're trying to handle them. And rightly so. I wouldn't want to be handled by a person either if I was a bird. But yeah, this year was the first year my son actually came out and helped me. And after he saw this one day, he says, "I'm not helping you with any of the woodpeckers, Dad." He says, "You can do those." I said, "Okay." All right, so then once we have all these birds banded and they're out on the landscape and on their territories, of course, we have to recite them to figure out how long these birds are living. We did this from March to July. A lot of times I would use call playbacks. So I would broadcast the calls of white-headed woodpeckers or the drumming just to try to figure out where the birds are on their territories. I don't have anything in here from our research on territory size, but on average, they're about 250 to 300 acres in size. So you can imagine walking out there trying to find where the birds are in that huge area of their territory. So a lot of times I use playback until at least I can find where they are, and then I don't use playback anymore. But it certainly helps me, and it maximizes my time in the field. Of course, just using a regular 10 by 42 pair of binoculars and lots of walking. And in the springtime, one day trying to find color banded birds, I can easily, using a Fitbit, get 17 to 20,000 steps in a day. So it is a lot of walking. Okay, so results of our banding efforts. Well, as I mentioned, most of the birds we captured were at water stations, 72%, and 28% were at nest cavities. And I said I've switched to banding more at nest cavities now just because I can really maximize my time in the field with my other job duties. You can see we banded a total of 57 males, at least during this time period. We've gotten a lot more since then, and 59 females. And of those, we were able to use 33 males and 24 females in our analysis of annual survival. And you can see that the majority of birds that we band are hatchier birds, particularly at the water stations. We don't get hatchier birds at nest cavities while we're banding because the birds that are nesting are all over 1 year old. And second year birds are our next most commonly caught category. And that's because second year birds are the most frequently the age of the birds that are replacing banded birds on territories after those banded birds have disappeared. So those two categories were our dominant ones for banding. Males that disappeared after holding a territory, so we couldn't find them anymore, and they were replaced by an unbanded bird, lived to a mean age of about 3.5 years old. That was based on 19 individuals, while females were similar and lived to a mean of 3.86 or 3.8 years old. And that was based on 14 females. So you can see they're pretty similar. They live on average of about 3.5 to 4 years. And the oldest males we documented were 9 years, 7 months old when they were last seen, 9 years, 11 months old, and actually one male that was 10 years and 11 months old. He was almost 11 years old. And females were similar. Our oldest females documented were 8 years, 8 months and 8 years, 9 months. And that last one, I have a little asterisk there because that female, when we banded it, I forgot to age her when I released her. So she had to go down as just an after hatch year. So that she could have been a second year, a third year, a fourth year when we banded her. So she could be older, but she was at least 8 years, 9 months old. So one of the things we have to, one of the assumptions we have to make with our birds is that when a banded bird disappears and is replaced by an unbanded bird on its territory, meaning it's a new breeder, we have to assume that that banded bird that was replaced died. We don't know for sure because our birds don't have transmitters on them. We can't track them to where they disappeared to. But because these birds are non-migratory, they don't leave during the winter, or they don't migrate seasonally even, elevationally, or move around, that we assume that once these birds are adults and are breeding on a territory, they will stay on that territory until they're either they die from natural causes or they're killed by a predator. That's just one of the assumptions we had to make with our data. We don't know that for sure, but that's an assumption. So when we threw all our data into some modeling to look at survival rates, we have an estimated yearly annual survival rate of about 85%. So if you're a adult white-headed woodpecker, at least 1 year old, and you have a breeding territory, you have an 85% probability of living from year to year in this habitat, which we thought was pretty darn good. That's a really high rate of survival, and you would kind of expect that for a non-migratory species because they don't incur all the risks of mortality from migration. But an 85% probability rate is pretty high, and we were happy to see that in these really heavily managed stands. The next line down there was an estimation of survival based on sex. So you can see males and females are pretty similar. There's no statistical difference between their probability of survival. And we didn't really see any survival differences between age classes. So if you were banded as an age class 1, which is a hatchier bird, an age class 2, which is at least 1 year old or older, and an age class 3, which is 2 years and older, there's really no difference in your probability of survival. But one of the things we don't capture here is that survival probability from the time the birds fledge to when they become independent. And that is the highest rate of mortality in most birds is during the fledgling period when they're learning how to become an adult, basically, and learning how to survive on their own. But once the birds become adults and have a breeding territory, they have an 85% chance of survival. So it was really good to get that information. That's something that had never been collected before, so we were really proud of this data. So one last thing I have to talk about is a colleague of mine, Dr. Teresa Lorenz. She did her PhD work partially in my study area to begin with, and then she kind of branched out on her own onto Forest Service. But one of the things she was interested in was looking at how far juvenile woodpeckers, white-headed woodpeckers, disperse across the landscape. So what she did is when she was monitoring her nests, when the chicks got close to fledging, she would cut a hole into the cavity, take a little piece of it out, reach in there, pull the nestlings out, put transmitters on them and band them, put them back inside the cavity, and then when they would fledge, she would track them across the landscape and look to see how far these birds were dispersing. Something, again, that had never been done before. So as I mentioned, she placed the transmitters on the nestlings while they were still in the cavity, and she did this from 2014 to 2018. She tracked these birds via plane and by vehicle on Forest Service roads. And she tracked them during their first fall after leaving the cavity, and then again in their first spring until she found if they were breeding at a known breeding site. And what we defined as breeding is she actually found a nest, or where there was an area of concentrated sightings with the transmitter indicating that the birds had established a territory. So what she found, looking at the estimated dispersal distance with the tracking data and throwing it into some computer programs, that about on average 5% of the juvenile woodpeckers dispersed at least 45 miles in their first fall. And then you can see that 50% of about 50% of juvenile woodpeckers dispersed at least 13 miles in their first fall, and at least 90% dispersed at least almost 3 miles from where they were hatched. And then in the spring, they dispersed 5% dispersed on average 40 miles in their first spring from where they originally nested the previous year. 50% dispersed at least 15 miles, and 90% dispersed at least 4.3 miles to their first breeding site. So you can see these birds are capable of moving long distances across the landscape. And in terms of habitat conservation and habitat restoration, this is really good information for managers to know, because it indicates that if you are restoring ponderosa pine forest across the landscape, and you may not have white-headed woodpeckers in that stand or in that landscape currently, there's a good chance and a good probability that dispersing birds, juveniles from other areas, will find that habitat because these birds are capable of moving really long distances. So this was really good information we found in terms of management and conservation for white-headed woodpeckers. The fall distances were based on 54 woodpeckers, and they used some really interesting modeling, looking at a bunch of different data distributions to account for incomplete tracking data. And what this was a bias-corrected analysis based on known dispersal distances. So a lot of times what would happen is they'd be tracking a certain bird. Oh, excuse me, had to get a drink. Tracking different woodpeckers, and all of a sudden they couldn't find one anymore. And so they would have to rely on that bird's last known location. And so there was a lot of incomplete tracking data because birds would simply disappear from the study area. And the study area was absolutely huge. You can imagine covering it by plane. They thought they were covering a lot of ground, but there are birds that actually moved further than what they were able to actually survey for. So using that kind of unknown data and last point of location, and using some fancy computer program and statistics, they were able to estimate these dispersal distances. Now, the spring dispersal distances were based on much fewer woodpeckers because there were a lot fewer of them that they were actually able to track to that first breeding location in the springtime. But I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of some of the other different techniques and different studies that are going on out there. And this one particularly using transmitters and tracking data and that to figure out, where these juvenile birds are actually moving across the landscape, which was pretty eye-opening for us that they were able to move so far. So, all right. With that, I would like to acknowledge some of the people that helped me on this study, my field technicians there, people that helped me do some of the bird banding, the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the funding for my position, and then the landowners on the project who allowed me access to their land, such as DNR, Western Pacific Timber, the Forest Service, and some private landowners there in the Weenass area, the Coffin family. So there is my email address at the bottom there. So if anybody, like I said, wants more information, if they want to read any of the papers that this data has been published, to learn more about the project and what exactly we've done with the data and how it was analyzed and things like that, if you're interested, shoot me an email and I can send you the PDFs of those papers. So with that, I will answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jeff.
So how well are these birds doing?
Well, what we were with the reproductive data, the dispersal or the and the adult survival data and the data that my colleague Teresa collected on juvenile survivalship, we're actually able to determine if my study area is considered a source for the population or a sink for the population. So this, what we call source sink dynamics, determines whether or not the habitat is suitable. And if the habitat acts as a source, that means that the population is doing well. They're producing more than adult and juvenile mortality is occurring. And if it's a sink, then they're not reproducing well, and the birds are being attracted to habitat that is poor and that they're not making a very good judgment by being in that habitat. So when we looked at all of our data and calculated a source sink analysis, we indeed did find that this Weenass area is a source for the white-headed woodpecker population in Washington. So that tells me that they're doing very well. They're reproducing well, adult survival is high, and both of those are high enough to overcome the nestling or the fledgling survival that is much lower during that, as I said, that rough stage between when they fledge the cavity and they're becoming adults, where juvenile survival is only about 50%. So yeah, so they're doing really well in the Weenass, which was very, very good information for me to figure out. Because like I said, when I started this, I had no idea. I had no idea how well these birds were doing in this really heavily managed habitat. And so that gives me really good hope for the species that they can do well in managed stands, provided certain habitat characteristics are met, obviously. But yeah.
Got another question.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
I noticed you banned pairs. Is there any information about what happens when one of the pair disappears? You know, instead of assuming that the other one has died if they leave the territory, is there any indication that they just lost their mate and moved on?
Well, we only had, I'm trying to remember. I think we only had 3 adults that we documented switching territories in the study area. We had one male that left, he bred on one territory, he disappeared from that territory the following year, and then the year after that, he showed up on a territory probably about 2 kilometers away as a breeder, and he stayed there until he finally disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. We had, I think we had at least one other male that I know switched territories. So, but overall, we found, at least within the study area. Now, birds may have moved out of the study area and we just don't know that. But what we were able to document, it's really rare for a breeder to leave one territory and move to another one. And if you think about territory dynamics, that if you're a permanent resident and you've secured a territory and you don't migrate, there's really not much forcing you to move across the landscape and find another territory if you've already secured one. Now, I guess it could happen where one bird gets kicked out by a more dominant bird, and then has to move. But at least within our study area, we found that was rare. Now, like I said, whether they moved out and we just didn't document it, that could have possibly happened. So yeah, so switching territories was fairly rare, at least within the study area. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. I do see in the chat, somebody had asked, do they mate for life? I always struggle with this question because it's so hard to define like mate for life. Like if a pair is together on the territory and they're banded and they've nested, they've raised fledglings or whatever, they'll stay on that territory together until something happens to one of the other ones. But as soon as there's a vacancy, there's a unbanded bird moves right in. Like we've never had a situation where we've just had one banded adult on a territory that did not breed, that was just hanging around. There's always floaters out there. There's always birds looking for territories. And as soon as there's a vacancy, that's filled by somebody else. So we had one female that stayed on a territory and she had 3 different males over her lifetime. So, you know, something happened to the other males and she stayed right in her territory, but every new male that came in, she ended up mating with them and nesting. So, what do they eat in winter is another question in the chat. They in years when there's ponderosa pine cones, they eat a lot of ponderosa pine seed. And they do that from August until the seeds are pretty much falling out of the cones early winter. And then they switch to just foraging for insects in the bark and in the trees all winter long, just like the other woodpeckers do. In the springtime, they switch to feeding on sap, pine sap quite a bit, which they excavate their own sap wells, just like sapsuckers do, and they mine the sap. And they eat that during the spring, just prior to nesting. And then they switch to almost completely insects during the breeding season. So, and then another question here is, do they eat the same food they bring the babies during that time? Yes, pretty much. Yep, they will pretty much eat whatever they can catch. Yep, but focusing on probably a lot of ants and things like that during the nesting season. Yep.
We have one more
Sure.
question here.
Okay.
Are you seeing any disparity between when the birds are breeding and the insects are available, perhaps due to climate change?
I don't have any hard data on that. My perception is just because even with the not doing the intensive nest monitoring that I did during the first 10 years of my research, I'm still looking for nests. I'm still finding them because that's a lot of times where I want to trap the birds. Anecdotally, it seems to me that they're nesting a little bit earlier now than when I first started this research 20 years ago. I showed you that graph where the peak nest initiation or egg laying date was the last week of April. I'm actually finding some white-headed woodpeckers already excavating cavities at the first week of May or even end of April, which to me seems much earlier than they did when I first started this study. That could be because we're getting into warmer springs, the insects are emerging earlier than what they have in the past. I really don't know, but there definitely seems, at least anecdotally, like I said, I haven't really looked at the data very well because I don't track it as detailed as I did when I was doing the reproductive and looking in the cavities and doing all that. But just anecdotally, it seems to me they're starting earlier now.
Any more questions? Looks like, at least in the room here, we're good. Thank you very much, Jeff. Really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. And yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed doing the talk tonight, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.